This is African American Lives and Landscapes on the Lower Tennessee River, where we explore the African American communities of Western Kentucky. So, who is this guy? I am Chris Thornock. I'm the Heritage Program Manager and Archaeologist at Land Between the Lakes. I work for the U.S. Forest Service, and Land Between the Lakes is a national recreation area in Western Kentucky and Tennessee. And what we're looking at today is African American histories here in Western Kentucky. We'll explore who each of these people are throughout the presentation. So, where is our area of interest? I work at Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area, and that is where I do my research. Land Between the Lakes is between Kentucky Lake on the west and Lake Barkley on the east, historically known as Between the Rivers. We're going to look at two general populations of African Americans from the mid-1800s all the way through the 1960s. There's the farming population and also the iron industry population. I put up two circles on here. The farming population lives in the rural countryside of Lyon and Trigg counties, and the iron industry population is located along the Cumberland River, where each of the iron industry furnaces were located. Just an overview of the iron industry history at Land Between the Lakes. We've got Mammoth Furnace, Fulton Furnace, Center Furnace, and Empire Furnace. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of the history of each of those. Empire Furnace was built in 1843 by Dr. Thomas Tennessee Watson. Empire Furnace stood on the banks of the Cumberland River across from Rockcastle, and soon after the furnace was built, Dr. Watson partnered with Daniel Hillman to become partners. Upon the death of Dr. Watson, Daniel Hillman took over as the owner. If you go to Land Between the Lakes today, you can see Thomas Tennessee Watson's giant monument right near where Center Furnace is today. So, upon the death of Thomas Tennessee Watson, in his will, it states, "I will and desire that my old and faithful servant Hannibal be set free at my death and be furnished with a comfortable cabin and 20 acres of good land and be paid $20 annually for my estate during life. I will and desire that the following and faithful servants, Caldonia, Mary and Jim Shoemaker and her husband, Isaac and Circe, his wife, and their two children, Jesse Cox and Marianne and his wife, and their child Hannibal, be set free." So we do know that Thomas Tennessee Watson was a slave owner and was on a personal relationship with some of his slaves. We can assume that he also had many more slaves in the iron industry. I went through some of the names listed in Thomas Tennessee Watson's will, and I was able to find Jesse Cox and Marianne, his wife, and their son Hannibal. And here in the 1850 census, Jesse and Marianne and Hannibal live right next to the overseer of Center Furnace, and they live right next to Daniel Hillman, the iron master. So even after freedom, during this period in history, they stayed on working, if not at the iron furnace, around the iron furnace. So Mammoth Furnace, built in 1945 by Charles Stacker. It was 9 feet wide at the top and 31 feet tall. By 1857, it produced 1,500 tons of iron. It was built of stone and brick, and it was sat at the edge of Lake Barkley. Charles Stacker died in 1953, but in the 1950 census, the Stacker brothers, who ran the furnace, had 101 enslaved people. So it took one furnace, it took 101 enslaved people to labor for that one iron furnace. Let's look down at Fulton Furnace. 2 years after firing up the Empire Furnace, located just 3 miles north, Thomas Tennessee Watson and Daniel Hillman built Fulton Furnace in 1845. Again, after Dr. Watson died in 1846, the ownership of Fulton Furnace transferred to Daniel Hillman. That furnace stopped firing in 1860. And then there's Center Furnace. 2 miles west of Empire Furnace, Center Furnace was built in 1852, and it was owned solely by Daniel Hillman. He called it the granddaddy of them all. Center Furnace was the largest furnace on Land Between the Lakes with The stack was 10 feet wide at the top and 35 feet high. Center furnace was the longest running furnace and the only one to operate through the Civil War. So this is Daniel Hillman. I'll just give you a quick rundown of that history. Daniel Hillman partners with Watson to run Empire Furnace in 1843. Watson and Hillman built Fulton Furnace in 1845. Hillman and Watson moved the Tennessee rolling mills up to across from Empire Furnace in 1845. Watson dies in 1846. Hillman acquires Empire, Fulton, and the rolling mills, and then Hillman builds Center Furnace in 1852. In 1911, you could still see the remains of Center Furnace, although it had stopped working quite a few years later and was falling down in ruins by 1911. Here's Center Furnace today. Again, this was the granddaddy of them all. We built a nice little fence around it to land between the lakes to try and stop people from taking souvenirs home with them from the ruins. Now, the center stack is just the center of a much larger operation. You've got people in the countryside mining the ore, cutting the timber, moving that to the iron furnace. You've got the iron furnace buildings situated all around the stack. You've got people on the top loading all the materials into the top of the furnace. You've got people on the bottom where the molten iron comes out, removing they call it pig iron, removing all the small bars of iron out and taking that away to places like the Tennessee rolling mill. And then in addition to the iron mill itself, to the furnace itself, whole communities would spring up around these furnaces. So you've got stables that spring up, blacksmith shops, the boarding house where the doctors and the salesmen would stay, the iron master's house, the ore labs, the company's store, and then different neighborhoods for the workers. At Center Furnace, you actually had an African-American neighborhood. It started out as the slave quarters and then eventually became the African-American neighborhood for the free people. So, why such a long discussion about the iron industry in Lyon County and Trigg counties? That's because the labor force for the iron industry was an African-American labor force. So here's Daniel Hillman in 1850 census, and he owns at this point Empire Furnace, Fulton Furnace, and Tennessee rolling mills. And his wealth as the iron master is $30,000 in 1850. And that personal wealth by 1860 has grown. His real estate, if you can see up there, is $100,000 worth of real estate, but his personal estate, the value of the things that he owns, is $300,000. And a lot of the things that he owns are humans. So, if you look here on the 1850 Trigg slave census, you can see Daniel Hillman's name down at the bottom, and then all the little hash marks. In the slave censuses from this time period, they only listed the white slave owner. And then next to the white slave owner's name, you had the age of the person, the sex of the person, and then whether they were black or mulatto listed on the slave census, but they were unnamed at this point. So here's the census. Daniel Hillman's name is where the arrow is. And here is the rest of that census for 1850. You've got Daniel Hillman on the first page. He's got both columns on the second page, the full column on the third page, and a partial column on the third page. So in 1850, Daniel Hillman owned 155 humans in Trigg County. But that's just Trigg County. So in the 1850 census from Caldwell County, he personally owns an additional 97 slaves, and then he also partnered with the Hillman Van Leer Company, and they owned an additional 57 slaves. These are all people associated with the iron industry. I found an ad from New Orleans from that time period where they discuss the Hillman Van Leer Company's celebrated Tennessee iron, where they're sending down iron, sheet, bolts, copper, cast iron. So he had an empire that was centered here in western Kentucky, but shipped iron throughout the United States. So in 1850, he had a total of 410 slaves engaged in Hillman-related iron work at that time. So we jump to 1860, Here's the Trigg slave census for 1860. As you can see, his Trigg numbers have grown to 255 human beings owned by Daniel Hillman in Trigg County at that time. 204 are male, 51 are female. So you can see that the emphasis is on male labor. Here we look at Lyon County. Lyon County has been created by this point. It used to be part of Caldwell County. And here in Lyon County, there's 85 females and 36 females for a total of 121 humans owned by Daniel Hillman in Lyon County. So in 1860, 376 people are owned by Daniel Hillman working in the iron industry. But that didn't include the people that were working at the Tennessee rolling mills. And they estimate that there were an additional 1,000 people working at the rolling mills. These were not on Daniel Hillman's rolls. These were slaves that were rented from the surrounding community in Trigg County in the Rock Castle area. If you look on there on the notes, on the slides from the Tennessee rolling mills, you can see what a giant operation it was there in Rock Castle at that time. Now, what about after emancipation? Luckily, after emancipation, everybody's name ends up on the census rolls, along with their age, sex, race, whether they're black, white, or mulatto, and along with their occupation. If you look on here, you can see Randall Mccracken is a mulatto farmer. If you look on this slide, you can see that Thomas Tennessee Hillman, Hillman's son, is now the iron master at Center Furnace. I was able to go through and tabulate the jobs that each of the people in that area around Center Furnace had, along with their race. And what comes up interestingly is that certain races are associated with certain jobs. So if you look at the first line and you see blacksmith, 5 African Americans are blacksmiths, 1 mulatto is a blacksmith, and there's no white blacksmiths living around Center Furnace. So African Americans are doing the blacksmithing jobs in that area. Brick masons is a white job. Carpenters is a black job. If you look at clerks for the area, the clerk of the iron furnace, the clerk of the commissary, the clerk of the hotel, the clerk of the store, those are all white folks doing those jobs. Once you head down into farming in the area, you can see where all of the white people in the area are working. Farm labor and farm owners. You've got 83 white farm owners and only 2 black farm owners. You've got 76 white farm labor and only 22 black farm labor. So white people are mainly concerned with farming in Trigg County at the time in this area. If you go down a little further, furnace filler, furnace founder, furnace hand, furnace keeper, furnace labor, all of those are African American jobs. This is after emancipation too. So after emancipation, the local African American population stayed on around Center Furnace and continued to do those jobs in the furnace industry. But some things did change. We're assuming that people are being paid at this point. And I also found this ad in the paper where they wanted a colored teacher, a colored woman competent to teach about 40 colored children at Center Furnace in Trigg County, Kentucky. So that African American neighborhood that's actually right next to the nature station, if you're on Land Between the Lakes, had not only a large neighborhood of houses for the African American community, it also had an African American church and an African American school there to teach the children for the labor force at Center Furnace. So here's the Hillman men. You've got Daniel Hillman on one side, John Hartwell, and then Thomas Tennessee Hillman. But there is another Hillman. So I found this article. Mr. John W. Hillman, born in Trigg County. He received a common school education in 1868. He engaged himself as a hotel waiter. He was promoted to steward of the hotel and then eventually became the custodian of the city building of Covington, Kentucky. And I found this in Prominent Negro Men and Women of Kentucky from 1897. Here is Mr. John W. Hillman. He is the first African American city official for the city of Covington, Kentucky. And he also served as the Grand Treasurer for the Grand Lodge of the Free and Accepted Masons of Kentucky for 17 years. Why is he associated with the Masons? Because his dad was a big-time Mason and often wore his Mason gear as seen in this picture. So we've got Daniel Hillman, John, Thomas, and the other John. John Hartwell Hillman headed up to Pittsburgh after the iron industry died in Trigg and Lyon counties. John Hartwell Hillman moved to Pittsburgh and helped found the steel industry that occurred in Pittsburgh. If you go to the University of Pittsburgh, you will see the John Hartwell Hillman Library there. Thomas Tennessee Hillman moved in the other direction. He went down to Birmingham, Alabama, and if you go to Birmingham, you will see the Hillman Hospital there because he worked as a major person in the iron industry down there. So our little Western Kentucky town created the steel industry throughout the rest of America, or helped to. So that was African Americans in the iron industry in Western Kentucky, and the hard part about that is we have lots of data points, we have lots of population tabulation, but very few names. Luckily, within the farming families in Western Kentucky here, we've got a lot more names and a lot more personal things that we can talk about. So, but one of the interesting things is, if you're gonna find African American names in history, then they're gonna be associated with white families and they're gonna be associated with early freedom. Luckily, we have quite a bit of African Americans that were free in the 1840s and 50s and 60s in Western Kentucky, so we have their names documented and we can talk about them. Some of the names we're gonna talk about today are the Youngs, the Corks, the Mccrackens, the Smiths, the Benberrys, and the Hendersons. So I'll look through each of these families and we'll have little stories about each of their fascinating histories here. So first I'm going to look at the Mccrackens, and they're related to the Whitesides. It's an interesting back and forth there. So Hugh Mccracken, a white man, was born in North Carolina in 1769. His father James dies in 1802, and Hugh receives a large sum of land and money. He's also the managing partner in the inheritance of his brother-in-law, David Stice, who has already moved to Western Kentucky. As part of a continuing family chain migration, Hugh Mccracken also shows up in Western Kentucky by 1820. He's living in Caldwell County, and in the census record, he's listed as one white man. There's nobody else in his household. In 1822, Hugh Mccracken is elected to the Kentucky House of Representatives, representing Caldwell and Hickman counties. You might know that in 1822, this area of Kentucky is the wild frontier. Hickman County land was only purchased by the U.S. from the Chickasaw Indians in 1818, and Hickman County didn't become a county until 1821. So in 1822, they elect Hugh Mccracken as their representative to the State House. In October 29, 1822, Hugh Mccracken submits a petition for the organization of Callaway and Graves counties. Later on, in 1822, Callaway actually gets created with help from Hugh Mccracken there, and in 1824, Graves County also gets created. So after Hugh has done his statesmanly duty of creating counties in Western Kentucky, we look at the 1830 census. Hugh is living in Callaway County now, but now he's got a house full of people. There's no mention of Hugh Mccracken ever getting married or having children. So what we're assuming is this is more of this chain migration with family members of Hugh coming to Western Kentucky. They're living with Western Kentucky. We do know during this time that he had two more nephews and their families moved to this area. And so we're assuming that the large amount of white people that all of a sudden showed up in Hugh's house at the age of 51 are family moving in from the east. In addition to the white people that all showed up in Hugh's house, we have two enslaved people, one slave male who's young and a slave female who's older. I would also like to note Hugh's neighbor, William Whitesides, living down the road. Again, this is one single white male living in Western Kentucky. There's no other white people in the household. However, if you look at the enslaved persons section, you will see that Hugh Mccracken and William Whitesides are two of only 3 people living in the area that have slaves in their household. Well, in 1834, William Whitesides passes away, but he had created a will ahead of time. And in that will, I'll try to read this correctly, he says, "I give and bequeath to my friend Hugh Mccracken and the other entire whole of my estate, real, personal, or mixed, at his discretion, to do my will and justice for 5 people of color this day heretofore set free." So William Whitesides has a African-American family living in his household. At his death, that African-American family is set free, and Hugh Mccracken is designated as the caretaker of the estate to provide for those 5 people. When we look in the 1840 census, just after that, you can see there's Dinah Whitesides. She's the only free person of color living in the area, and that was so strange that they actually wrote colored next to Dinah's name. And then you can see her family over in the colored section of the census from that time period. And we do know that William Mccracken is in charge of managing the Whitesides estate for that family. The total population for Callaway County at that time in 1840, you've got 10,000 people total, about 9,000 are white, 900 are slaves, and there's only 13 free people of color in the county, a good chunk of which are the Whitesides family. So here in 1840, we see Hugh's family again. There's only 2 white males living in the household at this time, but the enslaved section of the household has grown considerably, with 9 enslaved people living in the Mccracken household. And through later documents, we were able to go back and find names for the people that lived in Hugh Mccracken's household. So here's Hugh Mccracken's will from 1842. He starts off with saying, "Where am I at?" At January 1st, 1842, Hugh Mccracken is writing at Eddy Bend. So where is Eddy Bend? Luckily, he wrote us a map in 1841 of his property, which lies on land between the lakes. First, we can see that the property extends southwest from a bend in the Cumberland River. Second, the land deed states that the property begins at the bank of the river near Eddy Bend. So on this 1830 Cumberland River survey map, we can see that Eddy Bend is there's a big eddy, they named it Big Eddy, at a bend in the Cumberland River. This is a well-known big eddy, as it lends its name to Eddyville and also Eddy Creek. So it was a well-known spot if you wanted to put it on a map and say, this is where my property begins. Third, the land deed states that Mccracken and Thomas Tennessee Watson, his iron master neighbor, established the corner of their property together. And if we look at a map of the Watson and Hillman property map, at the area near Big Eddy, we look on there and we see the location of the Mccracken farm. So we know exactly where on land between the lakes that Mccracken and his family lived, at least the property boundaries. So later on, we know where Eddy Bend is. First, he says, "William Whitesides in his lifetime did constitute me his heir, though in fact only as an agent in the trust for the benefit and care of certain persons of color by him emancipated." So again, he's reinforcing this idea that he didn't inherit all the money, he's only managing the estate for the free African-American family. The avails of his estate at my discretion to be distributed as to the mother and children by him emancipated and none else. And so he actually makes provisions in his will to pass this on to the next person to continue to manage the estate of the Whitesides family. Secondly, on the temporal things I possess, that as soon as practicable, Randall and Perry, manservants by me heretofore emancipated, but at my decease, be paid $35 per year from after the first day of January 1836 until they are free. Hugh Mccracken has 9 slaves in his household, but he's only making provisions in his will for 2 slaves, Randall and Perry. And he's actually making sure that they're receiving back pay for years of service that he was alive after he's passed away. All my property except the land where I reside, the Carrington Survey, that was the map we saw earlier, I wish sold on a credit of 12 months as soon as convenient, and at my decease that all debt collectors so far as they can, so pay all my debts, and at my wish that Randall and Perry be paid 1/3 of the allowed amount for their service by January 1st, 1836, as soon as convenient, and then 12 months thereafter the balance them due. They've got flowery language at the time, but what he's saying is make sure that Randall and Perry are compensated as soon as possible. And I was able to go to the Caldwell County documents area and find 2 slips, one for Perry and one for Randall. Perry was given $280 from the Mccracken estate after Hugh Mccracken's death, and he signed his mark there on the top. And then December 10th, 1846, Randall also gets $280 from the Mccracken estate, and there is his mark at the bottom. So after Hugh Mccracken passes away, all the slaves in the Mccracken, or all the African Americans in the Mccracken estate are now free people of color. You'll look on there and see Millie Mccracken. She is the older female in there, and then her children underneath them, Artemisia Mccracken, Lucy Mccracken, and Perry Mccracken, and then all their children, and Catherine Mccracken Young. In her death certificate, it actually says that her parents are Hugh and Millie. So it appears that Hugh Mccracken was a successful landowner and a politician. He was selected as the estate executor for one of the few free African-American families in the area, and he lived with his African-American family until they were freed at his death. Now, we can't ever know the dynamic within that household because there's a free white person and enslaved family members as well. But we can see that the Hugh Mccracken family, after his death, became one of the founding pillars of the free African-American community in Lyon County in the later decades. So let's look at where Perry Mccracken went after Hugh Mccracken passed away. Perry Mccracken went to be a farmer on the estate of his neighbor, Edward Smith. If we look at I guess it's Lyon County at this point, census record, we look at the household of Edward J. Smith, and at the bottom you see Perry Mccracken, and he is listed as a farmer. Perry Mccracken ended up passing away in 1859, and all of his estate in his will was left to Edward Smith, who was also the executor of the will and the person on whose land that Perry lived. As part of that disbursement of funds from Perry's estate from the will, Edward Smith did actually pay himself $10 for waiting on Perry the last 8 weeks of his sickness. So Perry was dying, he was living on the Smith estate, and Edward J. Smith was taking care of him, and then Edward J. Smith, upon Perry's death, did charge him for a plow and taking care of him the last several weeks of his life. But if we look over at Smith Cemetery, we can find Perry buried in the same row as Edward J. Smith and all of the rest of the Smith family. In the oral traditions and the documentation that we have at Land Between the Lakes, the little card that goes with this tombstone says Perry, and then in quotations, a Negro slave, because that's the story that was passed down. And right next to Perry is Mary, again, in quotations on there, they say a Negro slave. And so what probably happened was after Mccracken's death, or maybe even before that, Perry moved over onto the Smith estate and started living with his wife, Mary. he was always listed in the census as a free African American, but the woman buried next to him was probably his wife who was enslaved on the Smith estate. But they are the only two African Americans buried in Smith Cemetery, and they're buried there with the Smith family. So Randall Mccracken, the other person who was provided for in the Hugh Mccracken will, he was born in 1805. He was freed in 1842. And then his son was born, his first son that we know of, was born in 1844. His wife, Melinda Young, was still an enslaved member of the Young household at the time of his son's birth. Randall Mccracken, although free, is missing from the 1850 census, but Hugh, his son, is listed as living with Millie Mccracken household. So although Randall's wife happened to be enslaved, they had an agreement apparently where Hugh, his son, was a free African American and living in the Mccracken household. What is interesting there too is that the older generation, Millie Mccracken and Artemisia and Lucy Mccracken, are all marked as cannot read. All of the younger generation don't have that mark, indicating that they are all literate African Americans in the 1850s. Randall Mccracken, who's likely the mulatto son of Hugh Mccracken, marries the mulatto daughter of John Young, Melinda. So in this census record here, you can see John Young. He is a white farmer. Underneath him is Shandy Cork. And then their next door neighbors are Randall Mccracken and his son, Hugh Mccracken, a son that he had with a slave on the estate of John Young. In 1870, Randall and Melinda are living together as a free family and in a neighborhood with an extended African American family. At the top, you'll see Shandy Cork. We're going to look at that? Yeah. At the top, you'll see Shandy Cork and his family, again, all extending from the Young family. You come down a little bit, you'll see Andrew Jackson Smith and his wife, their family. You come down a little further, you'll see Richard Young and his family, extending from the Young estate, and then Randall Mccracken, Melinda, and all their children, all living in the same neighborhood together. So who is John Young? Let's explore this man for a minute. John Young, the myth. When I came to Land Between the Lakes, I heard about Young's Grove and the founder, John Young. So in Milton Henry's, he's a professor, his history of Land Between the Lakes, it says, John Young, who was a freedman, purchased his wife's freedom as a slaveholder in Virginia, or from a slaveholder in Virginia, and they became the ancestors of the colored people of the community of Young's Grove. So John Young may have purchased his wife, but not in the way that it says. John Young, Sr., was born in South Carolina in 1780s. He was a white settler, and he came to Western Kentucky. In 1810, he's listed as one John Young, living in Caldwell County. This is really just my data. Let me jump past that. Let's look at it. John Young Sr., 30, can be seen in the 1810 census in Caldwell County. One white male, one white female, and 4 white boys living in his household. Jump to 1820, one white male, one white female, 6 white boys, and now there's a young white girl also living in that family. So John Young Sr. has a white family with him in the census records. By 1820, he also has 3 enslaved people living in the household as well. By 1830, John Young Sr. is now 50, and he can be seen in the Caldwell County census, just one older white male and one younger white male living in the household. There are also 2 enslaved people living in the household. The older adult female we think is named Jenny, and the younger male is named Joseph. If we look here, again, we can see one older male in the 1840 census and one younger white male, John Young Jr. And then, in addition to that, we now have an additional set of enslaved people living in the household as well. So, John Young dies. These wills are actually really great sources of information for everything that we want to find out in history. He signs his will in 1841. In there, he says, in November of 1836, John Young Sr. and John Young Jr. made a verbal agreement that John Young Jr. would reside with and support and care for John Young Sr. until his death. And there we can see one older John Young and one younger John Young supporting that agreement. In return, John Young Jr. would receive John Young Sr.'s estate. Sr. gives Jr. in the will, this is bequeathed from John Young Sr. to John Young Jr., quote, a colored slave girl named Melinda, age 9, a colored slave girl named Phyllis, 6 years old, and a colored slave girl, Margaret Jane, age 3 years old. The mother of the former, I this day emancipated, named Jenny. So here we can see those enslaved people, Jenny and Melinda, Phyllis, and Margaret Jane all living in the household. The young male is never named in the will. Then, the executors of the will are Benjamin Young Jr., or John Young Jr. and Benjamin Franklin Young, relatives of John Young, are the executors of the will. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see that the witnesses include Hugh Mccracken, their neighbor. So Young, Mccracken, and Whitesides all each know each other, and they all appear to be in relationships with enslaved women and then set those women free upon their death. Now, the Young family is more problematic or complicated than the other families because Mccracken and Whitesides freed all their slaves at the time of their death. John Young Sr. did not do that. So if you look at the census for 1850, you can see John Young at the top, Jenny, the freed woman, right underneath him, and then other free mulatto members of the family, all in the John Young household. In addition to the free African Americans in the John Young household, there's also 4 enslaved people in the John Young household. And we know that Melinda, Phyllis, and Margaret Jane are named in the will, and those are 3 of those people. If we hop up to 1860, John Young Jr. Is still alive. His assets, personal assets, are $7,460, which we know would include enslaved people in that. Right below him is Shandy Cork, and then below them are Randall Mccracken and Hugh Mccracken. The enslaved people in the John Young household increased quite a bit over that 10 years, but we do know that part of that family is the Shandy Cork family. So Shandy Cork moves up here and marries one of the female members, possibly the daughter of John Young Jr. or John Young Sr. In the John Young household. He marries Phyllis Young Cork, and then we can name their children William, Altira, and Andrew Jackson Cork, all living in that household. And then at the bottom, right next to it, we see that Randall Mccracken and Hugh Mccracken are right next door. So these are all interrelated families living next door to each other. These are the children that we have determined come from the Young household. They were children of either John Young Sr. or John Young Jr. probably. We've got Joseph, Andrew, Melinda, Phyllis, Margaret Jane, Amanda Jane, and Catherine Kitty Young. Joseph Young, after his father's death, Joseph married a free woman named Rebecca Whitesides from the Whitesides family that was freed earlier in this discussion. And they eventually went on to found the Youngs Grove community. So in 1882, Joseph Young acquired a large property from the Fuchs and Newby families. By 1900, Youngs Grove was operating the Youngs Grove School and the Youngs Grove Free Will Baptist Church. In this map, you can see where the property was divided up amongst Joseph's sons, Scott, David, and William, all occupying that land right next to the church and the school. And if you look here, you can see a picture of the African American children that were going to Youngs Grove School in the 1940s. In 1932, William and Matilda Young transferred ownership of Youngs Grove School over to the Lyon County Board of Education, quote, for the benefit of the colored school and for their deep interest in the public school for the children of their community. So they built the school, they raised children in the school for a few decades and then gave it to Lyon County to become an official public school. Who is Andrew Jackson Young, another son of the Young family. He married a free woman, Catherine Mccracken, in the 1850s, and they lived in the John Young Jr. household. While Andrew Young may not have been freed yet, he may have still been in the enslaved section of that census. His wife, Catherine Mccracken, who came to live in their household after Hugh McCracken's death, was listed as a free person in that census in 1850. By 1880, Andrew and Catherine are living together with all of their children. And here is Andrew Young's large tombstone in Barnett Cemetery in Lyon County. Barnett Cemetery is the main early cemetery for all of the African Americans living in the Youngs Grove community at that time. Melinda Young, she married a free man named Randall Mccracken, and they had 9 children. Their oldest son, Hugh, we believe died in the Civil War. Here's the 1860 census. You can see Randall and Hugh are free at that time. By 1870, Randall and Melinda are living with their large family as free persons. Phyllis Young, she married a free man named Shandy Cork in the 1850s, and they lived in the John Young household too. You can see Shandy right there as a free person living in the household, and by 1870, Shandy and Phyllis also have a large family. Margaret Jane, or Hannah Young, she married a free man named Richard Mccracken, another one of the free people that came from the Mccracken estate. And he became a U.S. Colored Troops veteran as well. He joined the 116th Infantry, and here they are in the 1870 Lyon County Census, Richard and Hannah and their children. Amanda Jane Young, she married another U.S. Colored Troops veteran named Andrew Jackson Smith in 1867. We can look on there and see Amanda in the 1850 census, and then here Andrew Jackson Smith and Amanda living together in 1900. And we can see that they were married for 33 years, so that's more helpful census data to know when they got married, which happened to be directly after Andrew Jackson Smith got home from the Civil War. And then we've got Catherine Kitty Young, and she married a U.S. Colored Troops veteran named Owen Benberry. And there they are again, 1867, right when Owen Benberry gets home from his service in the Army. So we've got Joseph Young marrying a Whitesides. We've got Melinda, Andrew, and Hannah all marrying Mccrackens. Phyllis marries a Cork, and Catherine marries a Benberry. And when they were married, Joseph married a free woman, Melinda married a free man, Andrew married a free woman, and Phyllis married a free man, and Hannah married a free man. And that's all before the Civil War in the John Young household. Andrew Jackson Smith and Owen Benberry were slaves before the Civil War, but they fought in the Civil War and then came home and married members of the John Young household. Where's the John Young household at? Luckily, we've got another map furnished by the Hillman Land and Iron Company that happens to show where the John Young property was. Right there on the Tennessee River near Birmingham Ferry, if you're ever on Land Between the Lakes. There is one historic site dating to the 1800s on that property. We were able to go out and look at it. And you can actually see the moss-covered bricks of where the John Young household probably stood. There is a large tree that would have been growing in the 1800s at that time that still stands on that property. It overlooks Kentucky Lake, and every year, many, many daffodils show up on that home site every year. So let's look at the Cork family. Eli Ingram, who was the patriarch of the Ingram family in the 1830s. We look at his census records. You can see him and his white Ingram family. There are also 3 slaves in the Ingram household in the 1830s. In the 1840s, the Ingram household has grown dramatically. There's many white people, but there's also 5 enslaved people in the Ingram household in the 1840 census. In the 1850 census, there are no longer any slaves in the Ingram household. There is, however, a large Cork family living as free African Americans within the Eli Ingram household. So at some point in that area, it appears that Eli Ingram freed the enslaved people in his household, and now they're living as free people. One of those people that you can see on this slide here is Shandy Cork. He's highlighted in yellow. His mother, Matilda Cork, is directly above him, and his brother, James Cork, is directly below him. Also, in the 1850 census, this is Trigg County here. Up in Lyon County, there's Shandy Ingram, a African-American mulatto man of the same age who happens to be living as a laborer in somebody else's household. Now what's interesting is this household happened to be the neighbor of the John Young family. So it looks like because the censuses were taken in 2 different counties in 2 different months, that they may have counted Shandy twice. Shandy Cork in the Ingram household and Shandy Ingram in the house where he was working that happened to be next door to his future father-in-law. There's Shandy Cork in the John Young household in 1860. And there's Shandy Cork, or there's his brother, James Cork. James Cork is living next door to Millie Mccracken and the Free Mccracken families. And then in 1863, the government came through, started taking tabs on who was eligible for military service around that area, and Shandy Cork and James Cork are the 2 only African Americans listed on that list because they were some of the few African Americans who were free and eligible for service living in the area in 1863. So we look at the Corks a little deeper. Here we see Shandy and his wife Phyllis in 1870 and their large family. House away from them is Andrew Jackson Smith and his wife Mandy. Next door to them is Richard Young and his family. And then the next door to them is Randall Mccracken and Melinda Young and their family. We'll look at the Smiths. Elias Smith was born in South Carolina in 1796. He was living in Western Kentucky by 1840. Andrew Jackson Smith was born in Lyon County in 1843 to Susan, an enslaved woman on the farm of Elias Smith. And oral history says that Elias Smith is Andrew Jackson Smith's father. So if we look at the 1860 slave census, you can see that Elias Smith owned 25 slaves at this time. Although he had a large white family earlier in life, Elias Smith by 1850 had no other white members in his household in the census and was only living with the 25 slaves at that time. And then if we go by age, Andrew Jackson Smith should have been 15 at that point and listed in that census. So in 1861, Elias Smith dies, and we can look at his will. He says in the will that his son Harrison P. Smith shall take care of and provide for my Negro woman Susan, and William Smith shall take care and provide for my Negro woman Ailsie. He continues to treat these Negroes different from all other slaves and keep them each comfortable with all the necessities of life as long as they live. So at the end of Elias's estate inventory, Susan is listed on there. That's Andrew Jackson Smith's mother. She's listed as 50 years old and worth $350. The last name on the list is Andy. He's listed as 18 years old, and there's no stated value because he is a runaway. So it looks like Smith wanted to take care of his lady friend Susan, who was still listed as enslaved in his will, but Andrew Jackson Smith, along with his friend Alfred, escaped at that time, in between the time that Elias Smith died and the will was enunciated here. Oral tradition states that Andrew learned of the Smith family's intention to take him as a servant when one of the Smith family went to go serve in the Confederate Army. So Andrew Jackson Smith, along with his friend Alfred Bissell, ran away to Smithland, Kentucky, and they fell in with the 41st Illinois Infantry. Andrew Jackson Smith became the servant of Major John Warner. At the time, African Americans could not serve in the Union military, so he just sort of fell in as a servant. Smith was involved in the battle at Fort Henry and the battle at Shiloh, and he and Warner were both injured in the Battle of Shiloh. One of Andrew Jackson Smith's job on the Smith estate was to be a ferryman across the Cumberland River. So Andrew Jackson Smith would have known the area, he would have known the people, he would have known the waterways, and so would have actually been a useful member of this troop as they went south from Smithland to Fort Henry and on to Shiloh. At the Battle of Shiloh, both men were injured. Story has it that Andrew Jackson Smith's job was to be there for Major Warner. And so during the Battle of Shiloh, Major Warner's horse gets shot out from under him. Andrew Jackson Smith grabs another horse, runs it out to Major Warner, and Major Warner continues his battle. Major Warner's horse gets shot out from under him again. Andrew Jackson Smith grabs another horse, runs it out to Major Warner, and at that point, both of them are injured in the battle. Andrew Jackson Smith got shot with a mini ball in the temple, but apparently it didn't go through his skull, it just stayed in the skin. And so Andrew Jackson Smith and Major Warner, both injured now, returned to Illinois and stayed there to recuperate. Smith actually stayed on Major Warner's estate up in Illinois until the time that he was able to join the Union military. After he recovered, he joined the 55th Massachusetts Colored Infantry. If you've seen the movie Glory, that was the story of the 1st Colored Infantry, the Massachusetts 54th. Andrew Jackson Smith didn't make it up there as fast, so he was relegated to the Massachusetts 55th. They followed the 54th down to South Carolina, and he participated in the Battle of Honey Hill. When he was participating in the Battle of Honey Hill, the person carrying the colors in his regiment was shot and killed. And so Andrew Jackson Smith picked up the American flag and then carried the colors for the rest of that battle. Because of this heroism, he was promoted to color sergeant, and he stayed the color sergeant for the infantry unit for the remainder of the Civil War. After the Civil War, he was nominated for the Medal of Honor, but at that time, there was a lot of backlash against giving African Americans the Medal of Honor, and so it never went anywhere. Military historians later found that story, thought it was pretty fascinating, and they helped to renominate Andrew Jackson Smith again. This time he did receive the Medal of Honor, and although by 2001 he was dead, his daughter, Caruth Smith Washington, was still alive. She went to the White House, and she was presented with the Medal of Honor. After returning from war, Andrew Jackson Smith married the daughter of John Young. He became a farmer. He bought and sold land. One of the things he actually did was, because he was so good at buying land, he would buy up the land and then help distribute it to the other African American members of his community, allowing everybody to prosper together. And in one document I found, he was even listed as a lawyer because he was so good at documentation. This is a photo of Andrew Jackson Smith's grandson standing next to the Andrew Jackson Smith highway marker at Land Between the Lakes. And this highway marker is actually on Andrew Jackson Smith's land at the location of Oakland School, a school for African Americans that was founded on Andrew Jackson Smith's land. Here we can see a school group from Oakland School in Lyon County that was founded on Andrew Jackson Smith's land during his lifetime. So we've already seen the Youngs Grove School and their children, Oakland School on Andrew Jackson Smith's property and their children. There's one other school for African Americans between the rivers at this time, and that's Henderson Chapel School. So I want to talk about the Hendersons real quick. Gilliam Henderson was born in 1846. He was a slave near Memphis, Tennessee. In 1864, Gilliam and his brother joined the 15th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops, and he served in Nashville until 1866. By 1870, Gilliam and his wife Melissa had moved to Golden Pond, Kentucky, in Trigg County, and they were working in the iron industry. He's actually listed on this census 2 times. You can see his name there twice. One time as digging ore and one time as works in the ore bank. So he was in the mining industry. In 1880, Gilliam and his family had moved to Lyon County and settled in a community of local African American families with the names of Bonners, Edwards, and Murrays. And at this point, he's listed as a farmer. If we hop up a few decades, the community has grown drastically, with families of Corks, Rhodes, and Ingrams all moving to that area and living next door to the Henderson families. And his son of Gilliam, William Henderson, became the African American community's public school teacher. He was also the African American community's minister, hence the name Henderson Chapel, and a position that he would hold until 1940. So the Hendersons moved to the area, created a church and school, and many other African Americans flocked to that area because of it. We have no photos of the Henderson family or the Henderson Chapel School and Church, but it was mapped in 1837, so we know exactly where it is, and it was right across the street from Henderson Chapel Cemetery, where the Hendersons are all buried. And lastly, I want to talk about the Benberry family. Owen Benberry was born in 1840. He was born on the farm of Benjamin Benberry, Benjamin Benbray. Here, he is a slave in the 1860 census, again, not named. We're just assuming that's him based on the age. And if you look right next door, you will see Edward Smith. That's where Perry Mccracken was living. And then right next door to him, the John Young household as well. In 1864, Owen joined the 8th U.S. Cavalry Heavy Artillery. He was stationed in Paducah for most of the Civil War, and then in Texas at the end of the Civil War, and that's where he was mustered out. After the Civil War, he came home to Between the Rivers and married Kitty Young, another member of the Young household. And they went on to have 11 boys over 21 years. One of those boys was Shandy Benberry. And then Shandy had a son named Ewan Porter Benberry. And we know about him not only from oral lore from everybody in the area, but also from TVA documents. The TVA documents say, Mr. Ewan Benberry was a natural leader of the 20 Negro families that formerly made up the community of Little Chicago in Land Between the Lakes. And although he worked in the building trades, his main interest was the motel that was popular with fishermen. Here we can see the Benbery Motel that was located on the Trace in Lyon County, at Land Between the Lakes. And this is before it was moved. This was Ewan Benberry's original motel on Land Between the Lakes. The Benbery Motel was across the street from Mary Major's restaurant. The TVA documents talk about Mary Major's as well. They say Mary Major's operated a small roadside restaurant in the Little Chicago community of Land Between the Lakes. Although the structure could barely meet health standards of roadside service, Mary Major's food was famous among the fishermen, hunters, and the few vacationers. Underneath the leadership of Mr. Benberry, Mrs. Majors relocated with the rest of her community. The new Tiny Castle restaurant across the highway from Mr. Benberry's motel serves country-style meals that draw people from throughout the 50-mile radius. Lunches, suppers, and Sunday dinners at Mrs. Major's are events that could be sampled by diet watchers only on special occasions. And so this is just government documents from inside our stuff, but they really felt that Mrs. Major's food was good. So, Ewan Benberry organized the movement of his entire community during the creation of Land Between the Lakes. He was a business owner, he was a mover and shaker, and while many people in Land Between the Lakes were actually fighting the government trying to keep their land, Ewing Benberry had already lost that battle once when the lakes were inundated. He realized that he didn't want to try and fight the government again, so instead he worked on organizing his community. He moved over, he bought a large tract of land in the Catawba area of Lyon County and then subdivided it out. He went to Catawba City and said, I need you to run water and electricity out to my area where I'm building a new neighborhood. They said, well, we don't know if people are going to come there. That's a lot of money to spend. If you put up the costs and the community shows up, then we'll reimburse you for the water and electricity. Ewing Benberry bought the land, he put in the infrastructure, and then he sold all the land plats to his community in the Little Chicago area of Land Between the Lakes, including building his new Benbery Motel, Mary Major's restaurant right across the way, their new church, and then all the families came and they moved as one entire community instead of being broken up. So it's a pretty amazing story. So that's it. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you to the Mccracken County Public Library. Thank you to Bobby Wrinkle, who helped make all this happen. I appreciate you listening to me today. I appreciate it. Thank you.